My name is John Van Etten. I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics office here located in Germany, and very happy to be talking to you today about the topic of organizational culture and development, and specifically the top 10 reasons why leaders fear culture measurement. So, Human Synergistics has been in the area of measuring organizational culture and using that information to help organizations to develop for well over 40 years. And I've been with the organization now, I believe, 17 years in total, and have had the pleasure of working with hundreds of organizations on the topic of culture development all around the world, across industry. And I consistently come across a few of these concerns and fears, really with every organization that we work with. These things are not uncommon. They happen everywhere, and I think it's very helpful for us as human synergistics and those consultants and coaches who help clients utilizing our tools, and clients themselves to understand the kinds of fears that may be getting in the way of the organization taking positive steps forward, utilizing a reliable and valid diagnostic to understand their culture in the first place, and to really implement the learnings from that. So these kinds of fears are things that I've always been particularly interested in. Again, if our goal is to help organizations to create positive change, um, that means that we need to sort of get past some of these fears, answer these concerns in competent and effective and helpful ways, so that the organizations and leadership teams can confidently move forward in development. Unfortunately, I do find these fears are not only common, but really do get in the way of many organizations being able to effectively not only recognize a need to change, but really have clarity around what is happening in the organization, in what direction do we want to develop, and what steps are we going to take in order to move in that direction. So thank you for joining me today. First of off the bat, after introducing the session, I have to apologize. This was actually scheduled to take place last week, and unfortunately, due to sort of unexpected events, I wasn't able to complete that session. So apologies to anyone who was trying to sign into that session. Hopefully, you have received the link to this one and will be able to join today. As always, we will be recording this, so the recording will be posted on our website, and anyone who's interested in accessing that can find us at humansynergistics.de, and under our videos section in resources, you'll find a copy of the video. So if this is helpful, I'm happy to share that there. As well, the PowerPoints that I'll be going over today will be made available to anyone who takes part in the session, or really to anyone who asks for them. So if you like some of the concepts that we have and find them helpful, feel free to reach out for that deck of PowerPoints. Good. Before we kick things off, I just wanted to also reiterate that we do have a chat available in this session, so I won't be able to hear anyone or see anyone's video based on the way the session is set up. But if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to type them into the chat. I'll be watching that as we go, and very happy to take any questions that arise. All right. So in the interest of tackling some of these fears, let's go ahead and move forward. So the first fear that I find leaders tend to struggle with is, it basically I would sum up as a fear of revealing weakness. The idea is that if we're going to measure the organization's culture, we are likely to find both some strengths and some opportunities. And the concern many times in leadership is we really don't want to draw attention to our quote unquote weaknesses. There's a lot of attention paid in organizations and in leadership areas around focusing on strengths, and leveraging those strengths. But unfortunately, in many cases, the things that really are holding our organizations back from their highest performance are things that are maybe not addressed for a little too long. So how do we address the concern that we might be revealing something that might appear to be a weakness, or something along those lines in the culture of the organization? The first way I would suggest we do this is to promote a developmental mindset, meaning, and it is true that we really aren't looking at weaknesses and mistakes in organizational culture. What we're looking at are opportunities for growth and development. If we can stop looking at some of those pieces of feedback as perhaps negative and criticism, we can shift our focus to recognizing that they represent opportunities for growth, things that we can improve, things that we can leverage to create greater engagement and performance in our employees. And so shifting the focus and the mindset from sort of a good news, bad news, black and white perspective to a developmental and learning perspective is something I always try to do in terms of how we frame this information to organizations. And it is absolutely true. The second piece that I think is very important is to ensure autonomy. The second piece, anonymity and confidentiality. So again, if people are concerned about negative feedback or challenges being illustrated in reports and data, please keep in mind, especially at the organizational level, when we talk about culture, Human Synergistics is guaranteeing and protecting the confidentiality of your members. We only provide feedback down to a minimum of 5 respondents to protect that kind of confidentiality. So this again is not about whether I'm doing a good job or not. It's about the patterns that are playing out in the organization's culture, what of those patterns perhaps we could leverage to see more positive improvement moving forward. And it's really about everyone's involvement. It's not about any individual being sort of to blame for what may be happening currently. So this next slide is really talking about those solutions with a specific focus on HS as a lens. So to promote that growth mindset, we want to use, in many cases, OCI and OEI, showing how the current culture is actually affecting the well-being of people as well as their ability to perform, and illustrating what patterns are truly statistically through correlations in your own client data, promoting those kinds of well-being and performance outcomes, and what patterns of behavior are counterproductive, getting in the way and holding us back. Again, not that that's right, inherently right or wrong or good or bad, but that moving forward, we know what kind of behavior we want to encourage and role model in the organization, and what we can move away from. Okay. The second fear, and you'll find that some of these are sort of interwoven and kind of connect with one another, but another fear that I run into, especially with leaders, is that leaders are concerned that whatever is reflected in the culture, especially negative aspects, may reflect upon them personally in terms of their own shortcomings. The mistakes I've been making as a leader are reflected in the culture of the organization. And while to some extent, again, that has some truth, the leaders are the primary factor that drive the culture of organizations. We need to address this fear and sort of shift the perspective if we're going to help organizations move forward. So the number one way I would recommend that we help to deal with this kind of fear is to share the responsibility and accountability. This really is not about any single leader. It's not about any individuals. These are patterns that are playing out across the organization and are a result of how we as an organization work. So really everyone has a part to play in not only what is currently happening in the organization's culture, but specifically in what we do differently moving forward and how we change. So sharing responsibility for that culture change, not feeling that it's pinned down to or the result of any one individual, is very important. The other thing that is tremendously helpful, especially for individual leaders, is providing support and resources. So offering the kinds of training that help leaders to understand, what this feedback actually is, that it's not about good news and bad news. It's about simply where we are currently as a business and where we aspire to move toward in the future. It's about giving them support in terms of coaching potentially and personal development so that they understand, how do I role model these behaviors? How do I encourage them in my teams? And what specifically can I do? If I'm going to be accountable as a leader, then I want to be accountable for my positive actions and changes moving forward. That's how typically I really stress accountability should be held in organizations amongst leadership teams. We don't need to hold leaders accountable for the current culture of the organization, although that to a great extent is true. I believe we need to focus on holding leaders accountable for the change moving forward. The current state, again, is just a starting point. The idea here is that we learn from this and we move our culture in the direction that predicts more positive results for our people and organization, business, and therefore we should hold our leaders accountable for taking steps in that direction. Again, role modeling and encouraging that kind of behavior, and really taking the first bold and brave steps in that direction. Okay. So how can we support that specifically? Sharing responsibility. There are a variety of ways to do this. One of the ways I like to do this is to start working with leadership teams using something like an individual level tool like LSI, so that leaders can, before we get into the big topic of culture, they can understand, what is behavior and how it affects performance, and what am I doing currently in my job and how does that affect me. Learning those concepts, in the immediate, meaning, thinking about my own behavior and my own stress level and my own performance, is a shorter connection for most leaders to understand before we get into bigger systemic topics of organizational culture that might feel a little more abstract. So sharing the responsibility by really teaching what it is that we're measuring, what part each member has to play in this, and that really what's driving our culture is what's for a large part playing out across our leadership team, and again sharing that responsibility and being brave enough to take some steps. Again, the second point I already mentioned, providing support and coaching. Human Synergistics has been involved in individual development and coaching for over 50 years. We've been involved specifically in development, measurement of, and development of organizational culture norms, I believe for about 45 years, 40 years. So we have a tremendous amount of research, as well as case studies, examples, best practices. Happy to connect you with resources, but these are very much the kind of resources that we would suggest that we leverage and our accredited consultants leverage when supporting clients and leadership teams to get clarity on what these results are, what they're really telling us, and what we can do with them. So that's the kind of support that we need, beyond just delivering good data and good information. All right. Fear number 3 is resistance to change. This is sort of, the sense that the uncertainty and effort required to put in this, that we have to put into this culture change can make many leaders feel a little threatened or concerned about that form of investment. Is it really worth it? Is the current state, maybe we can continue doing what we're doing, maybe we should just maintain the status quo? That'll come up actually as a separate point later, but how do we break through that initial resistance to change? This actually goes back to a very famous quote from Sean McCarthy, our head of our Australia, New Zealand offices, who sort of famously says that the most difficult thing about changing the culture of an organization is the culture of the organization. As soon as we come in and try to do something differently, those existing patterns and norms that have been playing out within the company for years, if not decades, oftentimes resist that change. And the patterns and habits that we are in make it difficult for us to step outside the box and do something different. And that a lot of times comes across as a sense of resistance within the organization. Two helpful ways to address that kind of resistance is firstly to communicate very clearly what the benefits are and what the vision is for this change and development. What the advantage of moving in this direction is, again, over essentially maintaining the status quo. That is illustrated in a variety of ways. I'm happy to talk about those separately if there are any questions. You might find videos that I have as well on our website around best practices for sort of introducing these tools and encouraging organizations to use this information and use that for positive change. Typically, the things I try to talk about in terms of communicating clear vision and benefits starts with values. How the ideal or preferred culture state that we are aspiring toward is essentially the behaviors that represent living our values. And this is tremendously helpful for organizations to recognize that, in one sense, very important and real sense, we're working to develop this organization to live the values that we're all about. And I think that's a very healthy goal. The second way to communicate and reinforce the benefits of creating this change is to focus on more outcome, if you will, criteria. So aspects of employee well-being and performance. So how addressing culture in a positive way, developing more constructive norms will promote things like engagement, resilience of our employees, customer orientation, reduce frequency of errors, the kinds of performance and well-being improvement that these development initiatives are really all about. Happy to talk about that further. It'll come up again a little later on. And by the way, I think it's on the next slide. In our reports and data, we can actually illustrate correlations between these factors, such as organizational culture and outcomes and performance of employees. So again, we can understand exactly what is helping us, what is holding us back, and therefore we can have some clarity around if we could, shift this organization's culture more toward the constructive, the more strongly positive performance that we can expect to see. Again, this is not about the organization is doing things right or wrong. It's simply about we recognize that we could be doing things better. And that is, something that organizations should always, leadership teams should always be, in my opinion, strongly focused on. Is how can we learn, how can we improve, and how can we do things better? We may be a very highly successful organization at the moment, but to continue to be competitive in the marketplace, to continue to be able to adapt to the changing environment that every organization is seeing in the world, we need to be ready for change. We shouldn't be resistant to it. We need to be open to those concepts and willing to support them with our actions. So good. So that's, again, communicating the benefits. The second point has more to do with involving leaders early on, so that resistance is lessened. One of the best ways to deal with that kind of concern or resistance in organizations is to start very small and build with small steps. So culture development is a large topic. It is a large initiative. It does take time and investment. But before we get to the point where we can build leaders up to feel confident in supporting and leading that, there are a lot of smaller steps that we can take along the way. Again, understanding their own personal behavioral patterns and performance. There are also very good methods for using the tools at a team level within the leadership team itself. One of my favorite methods to see what's taking place, to create some initial change in the team. You can do that fairly quickly with a small group. See a positive shift, see that playing out positively in our results and performance, create real tangible improvement, and then the next step of broadening that development is really almost just a step of scale. And now leaders feel far more confident in what we're doing, that this works, that this really leads us forward, and are more able to invest in that kind of change. I think, again, as we go through these points, you'll see that several of the fears are a bit redundant in some aspects, but and so too are the solutions to them. But I thought it would be logical to try to provide the top 10 that we really do find most commonly taking place amongst organizations and leadership teams to address them. All right, this is also a bit of something we've touched on before. Again, seeing the feedback in negative terms, the potential for administering these surveys, gathering this data, and essentially seeing something in the results, the feedback that is negative and isn't really what we wanted to see, if you will, and might deter us or derail us from maybe taking next steps. That's very much, again, not what this information is about. Understanding where we are currently should empower us to learn and use that information moving forward to create a more positive and effective future state. And again, a few best methods for doing this. We need to frame this feedback constructively, much as I've been attempting to do. Again, it's not good news and bad news. It's simply where we are right now. That may be working for us just fine, but maybe we recognize that's not going to work in 2 years, or that we could simply be doing things better. So there's nothing wrong necessarily with the current state. Rather, we have an opportunity to learn from that, understand how that's happening, and what's working for us and what's getting in the way. And again, moving forward, make more informed decisions, be more mindful of what I, as a leader, role model in order to guide our people and organization toward those behaviors that simply bring out the best and in our people and performance. So, framing that constructively and focusing on the positive aspects as well as the positive aspects for developing our opportunities. The next point is very important, creating a safe environment for feedback. That is, in many cases, more easily said than done. And I would also say that, of course, that is very strongly connected to organizational culture. In many organizations, it does not feel like a safe place to receive feedback, especially feedback that may be perceived as negative. So that's another topic that we try to focus on in the beginning in terms of how we introduce the tools and the data, and also in terms of how I like to introduce and progress, if you will, leaders through these concepts. Again, starting with smaller groups, before we launch a global culture measurement, starting with the leadership team, using something like the group styles inventory or even the OCI and sort of a pilot format is a wonderful way to help leaders, again, be introduced to these models, concepts, understand what we're really measuring, that negative feedback, even though it's surprising and perhaps unfortunate and upsetting when we do see it and hear it. It's important to know that. And as difficult as it may be to hear that not everybody's engaged or whatever the issues may be, we're not servicing customers as we should. The focus of our effort, especially as leaders, should be learning why that's happening and moving forward, again, what we can do in order to change that. And that's where the effort needs to be. So, one of the things I always find with fears is thankfully they tend to come up toward the very beginning of these kinds of initiatives. And again, if we can give clarity and good support, we can answer those fears and reduce those fears to the point that the organization is able to take positive steps forward. Usually, once we address these fears and the organization sees that this is not about who is good and bad, and the organization sees that acting on this information does in fact create more positive performance, then the fears tend to be reduced and the recognition of opportunity grows. And that's a very important balance to pay attention to. From my side, also from the side of our consultants, to make sure that we're balancing our clients' attention on the opportunity represented by this information and growth and development, rather than the fears that may prevent them or hold them back from taking positive change. Good. So another couple of examples of how we can do that. Again, if anyone has questions about any of these specifically, you can enter that into the chat. You can also simply reach out to our office anytime. Happy to follow up and answer questions. All right, we're getting halfway there. The fifth fear seems to be a lack of control or a perceived lack of control. Many times leaders feel that they'll lose control over the processes or outcomes once the organizational culture measurement and especially sort of the development initiative begins. You'll see this oftentimes in organizations, especially that are highly siloed or where leaders sort of maintain complete, strict control over their area of the organization. Not that that's not important, but part of what we need to think about is the fact that shifting culture means doing things differently. And that's a change across the organization if we're really going to shift organizational culture. And you may find that in some parts of the organization that feels threatening because, I've been doing my job the way I've been doing it for quite a long time. Now I'm being asked to do something differently. And even in a leadership position, I'm not clear on what direction that might be and how that might affect my job and my sense of control. So that's an interesting and important fear to address in order to help leaders not only get on board, but really to support this initiative moving forward. Dealing with that concern about sort of being out of control really breaks down into two primary areas. The first is involving leaders in the choice. So I very much advise against sort of human synergistics or our accredited consultants going through reports and boiling this down to the, here's the three things you need to change and do differently as an organization. I think this needs to be a dialogue. In a lot of ways, it's sort of like when you're going to the doctor's office, maybe not feeling as well as you could, and you're going to sit down with the doctor, and he or she is going to ask you all sorts of questions to try to get a diagnosis and get a clearer understanding of what's happening. And that really is sort of the role of diagnostic instruments like HS tools, to get a very good, thorough measurement of what's really taking place, how that's affecting the organization and its people, so that we can take targeted action with a prescription for change that will help the organization improve and move in the direction that they would like to go. Um, but that shouldn't be a one-way street. That shouldn't necessarily be the doctor just saying, "Here's three things you must do." Typically, these days, that now is more of a conversation, and it's certainly a conversation. I think it should be in leadership teams around, where do we want to focus? Of all of these patterns in our culture that we've discussed, which of them do we feel we need to focus on most immediately? This is done very easily. I'll jump ahead one slide because it refers to our instruments on this piece, but that, getting the leaders' involvement and making sure the decisions that we're making in, what we focus on the culture and what specifically we're going to do about this, our action steps, should be coming from the leadership team. With the data that we have, we can narrow things down and give them, basically a list of, here are the things that would be helpful, whether it's giving more positive feedback or clear communication. These are climate factors we measure in OEI, setting goals a little differently, designing jobs a little differently. We can narrow that down to key factors that need to shift and even in what way they need to shift. But I like to present that to leadership teams and allow them to choose what they believe they can do, what they can implement in their day-to-day work, and what they will be responsible for. And again, this is part of holding leaders accountable for the development. That development journey needs to be based on the decisions that the leaders themselves make around what are the greatest priorities here, what needs to change first, second, third, and again, what is our role and my role in that moving forward. The second on helping people to feel more in control when we're doing something different is to illustrate how this has worked previously, that these are not new ideas. The kind of culture journey maps that we help clients to develop, and we have examples of them that we can provide, but try to break this down into a variety of steps. We have complete timelines that other organizations have used in published case studies that show how this works. So giving leadership teams the clarity of what is going to happen first, second, and third, um, how we roll this out, what is the role of leaders, what's the role of managers, what's expected when, is tremendously helpful for helping them to see that this is not about being out of control. It's about doing something differently in a controlled way. And we should have very clear expectations and steps forward. And that shows that this is, not an uncontrolled change, which is unfortunately what I tend to see in many organizations without these kinds of instruments and methodologies, is that it is an uncontrolled, chaotic kind of change. And in many cases, even if the change was in the right direction and truly should have been positive, it fails because it feels unclear and out of control and risky, and therefore fails to get leadership and other buy-in within the organization. So again, empowering people by understanding how this all actually fits together and works, as well as giving them a clear step-by-step road forward, is tremendously helpful. At the individual level, for our tools like LSI, LWS, for example, we have workbooks that very much create that step-by-step best practice coaching methodology for people, so that they can see that tried and true tested process. All right. Then we get to fear number 6. So this is the fear of expectations. Very cultural, but in any case, the expectation oftentimes, and really should be, I believe, is that once the measurement is complete, that's when the real work begins. So even though, as I always say, human synergistics instruments are truly phenomenal for measuring organizational culture, ideal culture, understanding what the differences are, and giving us good, reliable, and valid data to understand what's happening and how that's affecting our people and so on. All of that wonderful information does nothing in and of itself to actually change the culture of the organization. That information needs to be recognized, learned, understood, and acted upon. And I find that that's something that a lot of leaders are concerned about. Once we do this project, once we have the data, and once we have all of this clarity and really understand what's going on, then we can recognize there's going to be some, I don't want to say pressure, but some expectation that we act on this and do something differently. That's absolutely true. I hold that expectation as well. I don't just want to deliver good information to clients. I want our clients to use that good information to create something better that they're benefiting from as soon as possible, and therefore in the very near future. But that expectation needs to be something that's balanced and something that is positive to help guide our people forward, not something that our people are going to be afraid of, being personally held accountable, sort of thing. So the first way to do that is by setting realistic and achievable goals. So that is being clear about what is the next step moving forward, what we do expect from leaders, what their piece is. Again, starting with small pieces, being very realistic, allowing leaders to take those small positive steps in a way that is as smooth and comfortable for them as possible. And once that starts to become a bit of a habit, then building and growing. So it's all about sort of the snowball analogy from Dr. Peter Fuda's wonderful book, Leadership Transformed. But that analogy around coaching and culture development of, starting with a small snowball and getting that rolling downhill. And it's all about starting with a small, realistic snowball that every leader feels that they can manage, and getting that started and then building with that. So the second piece here is around providing support and resources. So thankfully, Human Synergistics, I think, is very well armed to support and help with this. Not only, again, do we have decades of history and examples and research to illustrate how this is done in best practices, but we maintain a global network of accredited consultants and coaches who have experience doing this in organizations and can help support your organization in creating this change, coaching your leaders, top to bottom. So that network is always available as well. Support is very critical. Many times clients will believe they don't really need support initially. We'll go through and conduct an OCI culture project with them, for example. They'll feel like, we've got this, we can handle this. Then they get the data and the reports, and they, take the steps forward of, okay, here's what we're going to focus on. But when it comes time to really implementing this, when it comes time to do things like challenge leaders, coach them, many times it's helpful to have that external perspective and that experience. So I always recommend our fantastic network of accredited consultants for those purposes as well. All right. Concern number 7 is the disruption of the status quo. We talked about this a little earlier. This is a slightly different focus. Culture changes and challenges exist. Culture changes challenge existing power structures, unsettling leaders who benefit from the current setup. So many times what you'll find in organizations is that the current state, the status quo, is perhaps beneficial to a few individuals, but at the cost of many more. Happy to talk about this in terms of how that plays out in a variety of different ways. But the net effect, unfortunately, of that kind of cultural pattern is negative, and on the organization's effectiveness. So a lot of what this is, again, changing and pulling organizations out of the status quo means challenging and a bit of restructuring of how we've done things historically. And that, again, can feel threatening to people who are comfortable with the status quo or perhaps even benefit from the way things are right now. Again, this comes back to some points we've touched on previously. The first being highlighting the positive impact on the organization in terms of creating this change. Yes, it may create a little uncertainty in the short term. Yes, it may create a bit of insecurity in the short term, but it's an investment in the benefits that we want to see coming further down the road. What we are currently doing is not getting us what we want or is not getting us where we want to be in the future. If that's the case, we need to do something differently. Maintaining the status quo may feel comfortable, may feel safe, but it's very ironic in how that plays out. It is very much literally the sense of security at the cost of it. Maintaining the status quo and being inflexible and unable to change is, I think we can all recognize, a real vulnerability to organizations today. So the more we can help to clarify what the positives are for moving in this direction. And for this point, by the way, I would try not to focus as much on the organization's benefits, but perhaps on the individual benefits to the leaders themselves. One of the nice things I like to talk about is that culture development typically benefits everyone within the organization itself. So we can talk about the benefits that having a more creative and empowered culture will have to the organization in terms of its profitability and customer orientation and speed to market and so on. But you can also talk about that benefits of that kind of culture to leaders themselves. If you have more creative and empowered employees who are able to solve problems independently, think for themselves, and take action when needed, it means the leaders should have a little less on their plates, right? You don't need to maybe micromanage your people as much. You are encouraged to and are able to allow them to take some of those steps themselves, to share the responsibility, to be more proactive. And that should result, in most cases, in a situation for leaders that is more healthy in terms of where they're focusing their efforts and energies. The second point around involving stakeholders in this process is again important. If we feel that parts of the organization may be very comfortable with the status quo, those are parts of the organization that I think we really need to hear from. This is something we talk about when we design every project, but I would want to make sure that we have subgroups for those parts of the organization to see, well, what is the current status quo? How is that playing out and affecting them? And also, perhaps most importantly, what do they describe as the ideal state? Are they really happy with the status quo, or are they describing something quite different from the current state? Even though the status quo may feel comfortable, again, if we really ask people across the organization, what you typically find is we're not really satisfied with it. It may be comfortable, but we recognize this isn't really where we need to be. The status quo needs to change. And you actually find that there's, in my experience, a greater appetite for that growth and change and development than many leaders expect. A lot of times, members are enthusiastic to break out of the status quo. So hopefully we can leverage that. And again, a few good examples of how we can do that. Highlighting the benefits of this kind of development is something we could do through our research, case studies, or if we actually get through a project with the client, a culture project, then we can show the benefits of this within their own data based on what patterns are playing out and how that's promoting or detracting from our performance and well-being. And once we understand what patterns help, then it makes it pretty clear in terms of the benefits that we can expect moving forward. Okay. And again, involving stakeholders, making sure that we're hearing from different parts of our organization, looking at what people really are describing as the status quo current state versus the ideal preferred state, and so on. All right, this brings us to point 8, which has to do with cost concerns. Often a point on the topic of discussion with leadership teams early on is, aren't we a little concerned about the high cost and perhaps uncertain return on investment that culture development represents? I will try to keep my answer to this fairly short. I have talked on this topic previously. Specifically, I believe there's a webinar and a recording of it on our website around the topic of how culture drives profitability in organizations. And it is kind of amazing the extent to which organizational culture drives not only profitability, but it drives costs in organizations. One of another famous quote from our Australian office has to do with the costs of maintaining a defensive organizational culture. When we really look at costs, some of them things like employee turnover rates, the cost of difficulty in attracting and maintaining, retaining best talent, costs having to do with burnout, employee conflict, frequency of sick days. Those are costs that are fairly tangible to most organizations. And we can not only illustrate that culture is driving those costs very directly, but that as we develop organizations' cultures in more constructive directions, then we consistently see, lower levels of stress and burnout, less frequency of conflict with members, less sick days, so on and so forth. And it actually doesn't take too much work to illustrate that the benefit of this development is far greater financially than the cost invested in the information and good methods to create that change in the first place. So it is a bit of an upfront cost, but it's something I actually like to talk to clients about, because one of my favorite things is to be able to remeasure their culture after 2 years or 18 months, and also remeasure those KPIs around, employee retention and turnover and frequency of sick days, and actually illustrate to them that they have saved more as a function of their more highly constructive culture than the actual instruments and measurements cost them in the first place. So I think that's key. That can also be shown again in case studies and other research and references. The second point here is another one we do very frequently with organizations, which is, look, I completely understand we don't want to step in and invest in a top to bottom culture measurement and initiative right off the bat. We need to see that this works. We need to see that this helps and leads us in the right direction, and that it literally pays off. And one of our best ways to do that is to focus on a smaller part of the organization. This could be the leadership team, as I mentioned previously. It could also be a part of the organization that's struggling. In many cases, I've worked with clients who say, well, look, we realize one of our greatest costs is employee turnover, retention problems due to stress and conflict. We know we have one part of our business that is experiencing very high turnover rates and high levels of stress and so on. Let's start there. Let's just focus on that part of the organization, see what's happening, why that's happening, and see if we can create change there. Again, I very much like that sort of approach. It allows us to work with a part of the organization, demonstrate change in a fairly short period of time, because we're not typically in those cases not working with thousands of individuals and shifting culture. We're really focusing more on a team level and trying to shift the patterns within that team, which we can do more quickly than a culture initiative. Demonstrate that that kind of development does in fact pay off and drive the kind of outcomes we want to see. And lo and behold, 9 months, 12 months later with that team, we have much higher satisfaction rates, much less stress, people staying in their roles. And then the organization can really recognize that this works and justify building upon that learning and expanding that development more broadly in the organization. So those are the those solution points with direct reference to HS tools. All right. Point number 9 has to do with complexity and left sense perceived lack of expertise. So many leaders, I've always noticed, may feel overwhelmed by the topic of organizational culture, feel that that's outside of their sphere of expertise, and notice that it is a complex topic. And a lot of times this creates hesitation in leaders and leadership teams to address these topics, that they feel ill prepared and unclear how we should and can address them. So, again, this is something I'm involved in, I think, quite heavily with my work. So, a lot of what we do for end user clients is to initially introduce them to human synergistics tools, to the concepts of things like organizational culture and leadership, and how culture and leaders and KPIs all come together in an organizational system. And it is complex, but the first point is that we can, or the second point actually on this slide, apologies, is that we have clear frameworks for how this functions. Human synergistics not only focuses on measuring with scientific reliability factors like organizational culture and KPI outcomes and climate and leadership and so on, but in many cases, I think more importantly, we focus on understanding how these factors are interrelated in cause and effect structures. So if you're familiar with our how culture works model, for example, you'll know that outcomes like your employee well-being and motivation and engagement, as well as their ability to perform in their work and their tasks most effectively, is primarily driven by culture. It really isn't a big surprise. I hope not today, that the way our peoples approach their work, the way our people approach their work and work with one another, are the primary factors that drive how well they perform, and how their experience in that in that. So it's culture that's driving your employee engagement, motivation, and overall performance. When we want to understand why are people behaving the way that they are, why do they approach their work and work with one another in these ways, why is the cult, then we're stepping back in the causal model to understand organizational climate, those systems and structures and practices that influence the behavior of your people within the organization, things like how goals are set, how jobs are designed, how we give feedback, how we communicate to our people, and how leaders fulfill their roles and purpose. In any case, having that clear framework of not only what these things are, performance, culture, climate, leadership, but how they fit together in a causal structure, is tremendously helpful to organizations and leadership teams to clarify this, to reduce the complexity and help them to understand really how this all plays out. And I always think, most importantly, where my efforts count. Leaders can't affect outcomes like engagement and trust and customer orientation. What they can affect is how they drive the behavior of their people and culture. So we need to take our attention as leaders off of profitability and engagement and collaboration and those outcomes, and focus more on role modeling and encouraging the kind of behavior that drives those outcomes, encouraging an organization where people feel that their efforts count, that their ideas and input matter, where they feel that they can grow, where they feel supported, where they understand what the goal is and feel that they can contribute to it. Those are the kinds of behaviors and cultural norms that leaders can and should be encouraging in order to positively affect those outcomes. But understanding that structure, and again, where they can put their efforts that make a difference, I think is tremendously helpful in reducing the complexity. Again, in terms of expertise, thankfully there is expertise both within human synergistics in terms of these topics and the instrumentation, as well as, again, I have to highlight our accredited consultant network all around the world, who not only understand these tools and concepts, but again have experience in implementing them and utilizing them with real organizations. And that brings us to the final fear, which is actually a surprisingly common one. And I believe I've done another webinar and there's another video roughly on this topic. The fear being basically it's not the right time. We're afraid that now is not the moment we should be doing this. I articulated this in point 10 as we're sort of too busy to focus on changing. You notice this especially in organizations that are focused on short-term results, leadership teams who are focused on short-term results. Culture is a longer term goal. It's really something that should be baked into how leaders lead their organizations on a day-to-day basis. It should be doing something we do every day. So we shouldn't see this as a long-term initiative, but rather something that is part of our day-to-day work, I think, as leaders. But it is a challenge, and very, very frequently I hear feedback from organizations, especially along the lines of, we're in the middle of a restructuring right now. There's all kinds of strict change happening. We just went through a merger. This might not be the best time. I talked about this separately on another video, so I won't reiterate those points, but basically those points boiled down to the right time is the soonest we can get this information, right? It's sort of like the doctor analogy. If I'm not feeling well, if things aren't going right for me, I'm not right. My health is not what it should be. what's the right time to see a doctor and get their opinion. Typically, I think healthcare professionals will advise you that the sooner you can get that kind of professional feedback and diagnostic, the better, so that obviously we can correct anything that may be deteriorating or heading in a negative direction, and find solutions moving forward for what we can do to improve. So the idea of being too busy to change is one that I disagree with on a variety of levels. Here we try to boil this down to two topics to address this. One, I've already basically touched on. So this is integrating the culture initiatives into our existing priorities. Even if we are focused on short-term goals, that's fine. We can break that culture development journey down into short-term goals. Here's what we need leaders to do this month. Here's what we expect from you next month. Here's how we're going to be checking in. Here's what we want you to do with your teams, so on and so forth. So part of, and this is very common, part of that, mapping out that development journey for clients, again, that may take 18 to 24 months, is breaking that down into small, manageable steps that really are and do feel like short-term goals. And so if your leaders and people are accustomed to short-term goals and feel like we can't focus on long-term, we can meet you there and start and build. The second is to encourage delegation and distributed leadership. So this really has to do with the fact that in some cases, in some moments, everyone is a little too busy to focus on these topics. But if we can disseminate this effort to everyone, if we can make this culture development process part of everyone's role, which is really what it should be. And again, we talk about that in other sessions, but this isn't owned exclusively by leaders. It's not owned exclusively by HR or OD departments. Culture change really should be owned by everyone. And if we can share in that, then we find that even when a few people are overwhelmed and too busy, the majority of the people are able to step up and continue to do the things that need to be done to guide the culture in the right direction. And when a few of those people become overwhelmed with all of the things that are on their plate, they may step back while others step up. No organization has ever started this initiative with every leader 100% on board and every member 100% on board or capable of taking these steps. But what we need is a bit of a critical mass and the willingness of leaders to at least take the first step. And from there, we can build. So I think that's a very good point around not becoming overwhelmed with this kind of change. We all have a part to play in it, and encouraging that. Wonderful. I think those are my last 2 points. It is indeed. So aligning the goals using OCI and delegating those responsibilities through things like subgroups. So in many cases with OCI and our culture analysis, again, we can subgroup that down to very small specific groups and functional areas. And that's a great way to not only share this information, but to encourage people to take part and to delegate a bit of the responsibility for creating that change, again, throughout the organization. All right. That is the 10 most common fears we find within leadership teams and organizations around the measurement of organizational culture, as well as their concerns and fears that may hold them back from acting upon those good learnings and creating a positive journey forward. Again, I hope this is very helpful to you and your organization or your client's organization to help understand what those fears are, how we best address them, because it really is a shame if we never get where we're going because we're just too concerned to take that first bold step. So anything we can do to help clarify the benefits of this kinds of development and actions, and to help resolve and alleviate those fears that people may have, very happy to help to do that. So thank you so much for taking part today. I do have a few questions that have been typed into the chat, so thank you very much for that. Let me see if there are any questions. Actually, they might be statements. First statement is, what can't be diagnosed can't be treated. Absolutely correct. There's a very similar quote, something like, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, which is another very similar along those lines. And one of the great benefits, I think, of measuring organizational culture with tools that are reliable and valid means that we can give leaders information that they can trust and know is true and actionable, meaning that not only is this good information in reality, but it also means that if we do something about it, we can see positive change. But you're absolutely right. Without measuring organizational culture, we really it can't. I don't believe we can do anything effective to change it. There are, of course, other methods to developing culture without good data and instruments. Happy to talk about that separately. Unfortunately, that tends to lead to the 80% failure rate you may have typically heard of in the development of organizational culture. We and I can speak specifically to my office, see the opposite statistic. We see 80% of our clients able to learn from this kind of data, able to act upon it, and successful in creating more positive, healthy, effective workplaces. And that's what I'm all about. And I really do believe the only reason for 80% success within our clients versus 80% failure amongst other organizations using other methods to develop culture is the fact that our clients are basing their development journey on a very solid stable of good information. Okay. Second comment is it can also focus on less problematic areas, can report improvements in well-being and relationships. Um, PERMA is a great resource for complementing ROI measurements. Yes, there are a variety when we look at ROI measurements. There's a variety of them. I mentioned a few in terms of things like employee retention, sick days, stress, and so on. Engagement is another one. If the organization's leaders are clear the extent to which engagement is driving profitability, then that's a wonderful outcome as well. And also they differ. The outcomes and ROI measurements differ significantly, I have to say, based on things like industry. So when we're looking at organizations in things like raw materials and mining industries, then they're interested on outcomes along the lines of efficiency and especially mistakes or accidents, frequency of accidents, which can be extremely costly. Also in transportation, we work heavily in areas like rail transportation, and airlines are great clients of ours. Obviously, safety outcomes are critical to them, and safety incidents are an extreme financial issue. So creating cultures that where frequency of errors are reduced is a wonderful ROI. One of my favorites is looking at places like hospitals and in healthcare where we work very heavily, and understanding that you can actually measure, and we have research on this, outcomes in hospitals along things like the speed with which patients recover from surgery, the number of complications patients experience during their recovery period, and fascinatingly enough, even things like the frequency of bed falls. Those kinds of accidents and errors are outcomes strongly correlated to culture. And by developing more constructive hospitals and healthcare arenas, we find more positive returns on investment in those kinds of, I think, very important key criteria. So thank you for the resource. I'm not familiar with that one, but we also have lists of recommended custom outcome criteria that get at things like aspects of investment, return on investment, costs, and so on. But that's one of those aspects that we always try to customize for our clients so that we are measuring the things that really matter to them, that they recognize do drive their business performance in a very tangible way, and that they want to see improve over time so that as they do, they can see that tangible return. Very good. So thank you for all of the input. If there are any other final questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat. Otherwise, I believe I have reached the end of my content for today. So I would thank everyone for taking part who joined. Very much appreciate the comments. And again, this video as well as the PowerPoints will be made available to you. So if you have any other questions or we can help anyone further, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. Thank you.